Now that we've got the unauth state changed listener set up, if we're authenticated, we're always redirected back to the app component, which is where our chat will live. If we log this user value that we have access to within unauth state changed, when we take a look at our console, we can see that it's an object which includes all of our user information for our currently authenticated user. And in developing the chat portion of our app, we're going to be creating a lot of components, many of which are going to need to access this user data. It'd be nice if we could execute a function with the name, for example, of setUser, where we pass in the user data and put all of that data on global state so any of our React components that want to make use of it can. To do this, we'll set up the state management system Redux within index.js, and we'll import a few packages to set that up. We'll import the function createStore from Redux. We'll import the provider component from React Redux, as well as the function composeWithDevTools in order to set up our Redux DevTools extension. Now, to create our global state, all we need to do is create a store variable, and this will store the return value from executing the createStore function. And to that, we just need to pass an empty function for now, as well as composeWithDevTools, and make sure to execute that function. To provide this global state, this global store to all of our components, we'll use the provider component. We'll wrap our router with it. Provider will provide our global state to any component that wants to use it, and we'll pass that down using the store prop. We'll pass the store variable to it. Now that we've set that up, if we take a look at our browser, we can see our DevTools icon for Redux is now glowing green. If we go to the Redux DevTools extension within our console, we can see this interface which we'll use in order to interact with our global state. And currently it's empty because we haven't set up our state, any of the properties on state, or any of the actions that we'll be using to interact with state. But we'll begin by creating an actions folder within our source folder. And this will contain two files, an index.js file as well as a types file. And action types will be responsible for determining what type of change we want to make to our global state. So within our types file, we'll create our first type. This will be a variable called setUser equal to the string of the same name, setUser. We'll put this as a variable and export it since we're going to be using it in a number of files. And the first place we'll use it is in this index.js file that we created in our actions folder. We'll import all of the exports, all of the exported types from our types file as an object called action types. Then we'll create our first action, which will have the same name, setUser, but written in a camel case syntax. And to this function, we'll pass in the user data that we'll be getting. And from our action, we want to return two things. First of all, the type. And the type we'll return is the type that we just created, the setUser type on our action types object, and then a payload. So actions will also be responsible for passing the data that our state needs to be changed with. So on our payload object, we'll have one property of current user set to the user data that's passed into it. Now, in order to actually perform the change to state of setting the user, we're going to create functions called reducers, and we'll do that within this reducers folder and create just an index.js file within it. Here we'll also need to import our action types from our actions folder in the types file. And the first reducer function that we'll create will be called user reducer, because it will reduce all of the user related data. It'll take a state argument as well as the action that's coming in, and within the body we'll set up a switch statement where it will update state accordingly depending upon the type of action that's coming in as we set with that type variable. So in the case that this is a setUser action, the type of setUser, we're going to want to update state where we first take the current user data that's coming from action.payload.currentUser, the user data that we put on the current user property in our setUserAction, and we also want to set the property isLoading to false, which we'll create on our state. And we also need to set up a default case in every reducer where if it doesn't match a given action type, all it's going to do is just return the state as it was. And to this state parameter, we're going to set a default value of initial user state. So this is what our user state will look like without any changes. So we'll create this as an object just above our reducer, where current user will be set to null and isLoading will be set to true by default. Now we want our reducer functions to only operate on a certain part of state. For example, our user reducer should only modify our user property on the global state. So we'll create this variable called rootReducer, and it will use a function which will import from Redux called combine_reducers, and combine_reducers will allow us to determine what property on global state a given reducer updates. So we'll include combine_reducers, and within the object that it takes, we can determine that user reducer will be updating and put its state values on this user property. And now once we have that, we can export default this rootReducer variable, and we'll replace our empty function within createStore with rootReducer to get our entire state object. And we'll make sure to import rootReducer from the reducers folder. We'll save all of our files, and if we refresh our app, we take a look at our Redux DevTools and click on the state option, you can see we have this one property of user, and on that property, current user property as well as isLoading. So we successfully set up our first action, action type, and reducer. In order to set our user data on global state with the setUserAction, we'll need the connect function from React Redux. And as the name implies, connect will allow us to connect our Redux state and actions with a given React component. So we'll wrap root with connect to execute it, and in a set of parentheses before wrapping root, we'll have access to first the global state with the map state to props argument, but we don't need any state, so we'll just pass in null. And then we have this map dispatch to props argument as the second argument. And this is where we'll get our actions. And all we need to do to get setUser is to destructure it from the map dispatch to props object. So we'll destructure setUser, and we'll import setUser from the index file of the actions folder. And what connect and map dispatch to props will do is it will take this setUserAction and put it on our props object of the component that we're wrapping with connect. So now setUser will be on this.props. So if we save our index file, when our page reloads, we'll execute the setUserAction, and our current user property on the user object is updated to the value that we're getting from our on/off state changed listener.